Go ahead and open your Bibles up to the book of Daniel. And in particular, if you'll go to Daniel chapter 6. And that's where these words that are on the screen come from. Daniel distinguished himself. Daniel chapter 6 and at verse 3. To give a bit of context here, at Daniel 6, at the beginning of it, Darius the Mede has just taken over the realm of Babylon. And verse 1, he sets 120 satraps over his kingdom. Verse 2, he sets 3 governors over the satraps, and one of those governors was Daniel. Verse 3 tells us that Daniel excelled above his peers. Literally, the wording that's used here when it says that, that he distinguished himself, the idea is that he was preferred above. And so if you're going to select one of them in order to be the leader among the governors, Daniel's the one. He is preferred above the rest. And so the king was so impressed with Daniel that he thought to set him over the whole realm. He planned to exalt him very much the same as what we would see with Joseph and how Joseph was given second in command really in Egypt. That's where Daniel was going to be in the realm of Darius. And so we might wonder, well, what distinguished Daniel? Why is it that Darius saw this in him? And the things that we see in the text here, again at verse 3, we're told that he had an excellent spirit. I don't doubt that Daniel had a great aptitude, that he was motivated to succeed. And those kinds of things are good and they're necessary, but that's not all that this is saying to us about Daniel. He set himself apart from others because he was a man of integrity. He was interested in what is right. He had a commitment to what was right, and he would have a sense of honor. And those are the kinds of things that gave him this excellent spirit that impressed Darius. Now, notice verse 4. Though Darius likes Daniel, not everybody likes Daniel. In verse 4, the governors and satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find no charge or fault because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him. He's got some enemies, and his enemies are intent on bringing him down. And we're not told the reasons in the text. It could be that they're jealous. It could be that they despise him because of his ethnicity. Later on, when they're talking to Darius and they speak about Daniel, they make sure that he understands he's a captive. Now, why is he in our government? He's a captive. He was brought here as a slave. But we're not really made aware of all the reasons why they would oppose Daniel, but it really doesn't matter. The point is they don't want him to govern over them. And they're going to do what they can in order to avoid that, to bring Daniel down. The problem is they found nothing. There's no charge they could bring against him. There's no fault in Daniel because he's faithful. And you can be assured that they did a thorough search. Now understand, the realm of Darius doesn't have a long history. It just began. But you can go back and you can check the Babylonian records, and I'm sure they were doing that because Daniel had a position in Babylon as well under Nebuchadnezzar. And so they would go back and they would serve the record that he had while Nebuchadnezzar was ruler in the realm. And they could find nothing because Daniel was faithful. Daniel was faithful. 3 words that describe Daniel's life. He was faithful, and he distinguished himself. Whether it be his public service to Nebuchadnezzar, his public service to Darius, he always presented himself as faithful, and that's why it could be said of him that he distinguished himself. Consistently, he did what was right. He was faithful to his duties, whatever it was, and whomever he was to serve. He was trustworthy. He was dependable. And, these are the kind of attributes, I think, that annoyed his contemporaries about him and perhaps caused them to not look as good as they might want to look before the king. they fall in the shadow of Daniel. Go back to chapter 1 with me, if you will, because I think when we talk about Daniel distinguishing himself, as chapter 6 and verse 3 says, the discussion of that really starts in chapter 1, when we're first introduced to Daniel. And, let's acknowledge something just right off the start, that Daniel had some things going for him. Now, yes, he is a captive and he's brought to a strange land and so forth, but in Daniel 1 and verse 4, here is the group of young men that Daniel is a part of. These are those who were the nobles in Judah. And it says that they were to select young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge, and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace. He's been dealt a good hand, so far as the ability that he has already. But understand there are plenty of people who've been dealt a good hand who squander it. And so he had to actually do something with what he had. And especially so when circumstances change. And his circumstances changed drastically. These young men had been taken from Judah, where, again, in Judah, they are nobles, and now in Babylon, they're captives. They're slaves. They've been taken from their home, and they've been transplanted into a foreign land. They're surrounded by strangers. They're listening to a strange language they don't understand or know, and there's strange customs going on. And in that kind of scenario, it'd be very easy for a young man to lose himself. But Daniel does not. Daniel is going to stand for what is right. He's going to stand for the truth of God. And so understand, there was Daniel and several others who were with him, but right at the very beginning of our introduction to Daniel, he distinguishes himself. Take a look at verse 8. It says in verse 8 that Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself. He's going to make himself different than what the rest are doing. And not he alone. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are their Hebrew names. They're going to stand along with him. But in verse 5, the king had appointed some daily provisions for these young Hebrew men. And we're not told what was in them. We know that the king's wine was there and some delicacies were there, but were there some meats that had been offered to idols? Maybe there were some unclean animals in the midst of what was being offered. Maybe the preparation of them was unclean. We don't know all the details of it, but whatever it was, in the exercise of Daniel's faith, he decided that he needed to refuse what the king was offering him. This was not a matter of personal convenience or preference. It's not that Daniel was a vegetarian and so he wasn't going to eat meat. That's not what's going on. This is a matter of conscience. It's a matter of faith. And so he makes a stand. And when he makes a stand, look at verse 9. It says, now God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. And so Daniel makes a stand on faith, and God blesses him for it. And we're going to see that happens consistently in his life. He goes through some difficult times, but he always stands on faith, and God always blesses him for doing so. Now, still in chapter 1, verses 6 and 7, verse 6 gives us their Hebrew names. There's Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. To them, the chief priest of the eunuchs gave names. He gave Daniel the name BELTESHAZZAR. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. And so they now have new names that go with this new realm that they're a part of. And though his new name does appear in the book a few times, it's noteworthy, I think, that Daniel never uses it of himself. It's always when Nebuchadnezzar talks about him, or when Belshazzar speaks of him, or when Belshazzar's mother speaks of it. It's always somebody else who uses his Babylonian name. And there's a reason for that. Names are significant. You've heard me talk about the significance of names in the Bible before. And so his name Daniel means judgment of God, or God is my judge. And so, this is a good name. This is a name that honors Jehovah. But now here he is in Babylon, and they've renamed him Belshazzar. And his new name means Bel protects his life, or Baal protects his life. He doesn't want to exalt Baal. And so he continues to refer to himself as Daniel, because God is my judge. He stands before God. And so he distinguishes himself in this way, not wanting to defile himself, even with a Babylonian name that was given to him. And so in chapter 1, because Daniel purposed in his heart to serve God, he was blessed by God, and he continued to distinguish himself as a faithful servant of God. And so in verse 9, as we mentioned, God brought Daniel into favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. We drop down a little bit further in the text, verse 14 and 15. God blesses Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the 10-day trial period they had of his diet rather than the king's diet. And so they were good and healthier in appearance than their counterparts who ate what the king was giving them. In verse 17, God blessed Daniel and his friends so that they had knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom. They're learning a new language. They're learning a new culture. And God blessed them so that they were able to learn this effectively. And I believe the point of this is more effectively than their counterparts who were also Jewish but had given in to what the king was giving them. And then also in verse 17, specifically about Daniel, God gave Daniel understanding in visions and dreams, and that would become important in the narrative of his life as he would interpret a few dreams and also some writing on a wall and things of that nature. And so beginning in the first chapter, Daniel distinguished himself. He demonstrated that his life is wrapped up in the things of God, and that he's not going to be moved from that. And then as we keep going through the text, chapter 2, he distinguishes himself again from the magicians and the astrologers and the sorcerers of Babylon. None of them can give the interpretation, but chapter 1, verse 17, God blessed him with the ability, with understanding when it comes to visions and dreams. And so he's distinguished in chapter 2. In chapter 3, he doesn't appear there with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and so we don't know where he is or what he's doing at that point, but he shows up again in chapter 4, and he distinguishes himself once more because Nebuchadnezzar, as Nebuchadnezzar talks about Daniel and his relationship to him, over and over, he speaks of him 3 times as one who has the spirit of the holy God in him. That's quite a compliment. He has the Spirit of God in him. And then in chapter 5, again, he is distinguished 2 times in chapter 5, identified as one in whom is the Spirit of the Holy God, rather than accept the offerings of Belshazzar. Remember, I'm going to give you all these gifts. I'm going to make you third in the kingdom. And instead, he faithfully revealed what the writing on the wall was, and that is, your kingdom's done. And it ceased that night. And so Daniel chapter 6 and verse 3, when it says that he distinguished himself, understand there is a lifetime that is worked towards that. It's not just on that one occasion. This is what he has done his entire life. All right, so let's go back to Daniel chapter 6 again. And so we've got this man who is honorable, a man of integrity. He's not moved by bribes. He loves the truth. He's faithful in his business affairs. He's faithful in his service to God. How do you topple such a man? Because that's the task that the other governors and the satraps are faced with, is we want to bring them down, but how do you bring them down? And so in verse 5, here is what they came up with. We shall not find any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God. The Babylonian record shows him to be spotless. And so the only way we're going to bring him down is it's going to have to deal with religious conviction. Now understand, their desire is not to cause him to stumble in his faith. When we read that, that's what we might conclude is, well, they're going to try and make him stumble. They're going to make him not be faithful to God. No, that's not the point at all. In fact, their plan relies upon his faithfulness. If Daniel will not be faithful to God, then their plan will not work. They can come to Darius and say to Darius, Daniel doesn't pray anymore. And Darius, okay, all right. I'm still going to promote him. Because to Darius, that doesn't matter a whole lot. But if they put in a law which makes his religious convictions incompatible with the law of the land, they know Daniel's character. They know he's going to serve God and he's going to forsake the law of the land to do so. And so their plan relies upon his faithfulness. They understand his religious convictions are paramount to him. And so that's why they're able to bring this plan into action. And so they come to the king. Verse 6, the governors and the satraps thronged before the king and said thus to him, King Darius, live forever. It's interesting, the word that's used here. They throng before the king. Strong says to gather tumultuously. This was not just a quiet chat with the king. This is a large number of them who despise Daniel and want to see Daniel brought down. And you know, they're not just making a suggestion to the king either. They're being rather forceful in what they're doing. Verse 7, all the governors of the kingdom and the administrators and the satraps, the counselors and the advisors have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. May I say to you that their plan is based on a lie, right from the very onset. They just said to Darius, all the governors of the kingdom, administrators, satraps, counselors, advisors, do you think they consulted Daniel on this plan? Because he's one of the governors of the land. Daniel was left out on this entirely. Now, I think he understands something's going on when he sees this throng of people around the king. And when we get to verse 10, Daniel knows that the thing has been signed. But Daniel did not participate in this consultation. He was excluded, and Daniel would have been a voice of dissent in this consultation. So their plan, as they lay it out to the king, you know, we all think so highly of you, Darius. That's not true. This has nothing to do with Darius and how much they like Darius. This is about bringing Daniel down. He is a pawn in their plan. And so we want to make a decree. It's going to be this firm decree that makes it illegal to pray or petition to anybody but you. You know, whoever would be so uncivilized as to petition someone other than Darius, well, they should be thrown into a den of lions. And understand, they're not just looking to bring Daniel down a few notches. The plan is now, let's get him dead. We want to kill him. So this is the plan that they lay out, and of course they're trying to play on his ego. What king doesn't like people to exalt him and think well of him? Although really, if you think about this, for 30 days people must petition no one but the king. I wonder how many days into that he would finally realize, uh-oh, this was a bad idea. I wish these people would quit coming to me with all their problems, right? But he's not going to think about that at this point. It's about the honor that they're talking about. Verse 8, now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter. So now they had all their bases covered with this, because once it was signed, it could not be changed. That's the law of the Medes and the Persians. The king cannot undo a law that he himself has signed. It's stated here in verse 8, it's repeated in verse 12, and again in verse 15. Once it is signed into law, it is law. The Medes and the Persians had this set in stone policy, if you will. And I think that it was good intentioned, but there were some bad side effects that could happen as a result of it. Now, why was it a good intentioned law? They don't want the king to simply ignore the law to give a friend a favor. And so, you know, it's the law is the law, and you got to obey the law, and the king can't even change the law. That takes away favoritism that the king could bestow upon people. It also would keep kings from making laws just on a whim, because they have to take into account the long-term ramifications of whatever law this is. You know, maybe he gets up on the wrong side of the bed one morning, and so he makes a law that nobody can talk to him before a certain time in the day, and you know, but then that becomes a foolish law, you know, the next day when he's in a good mood, but nobody will talk to him now. You know, and so it's to keep the king from making and repealing laws over and over, making laws according to his whim, and hopefully in the process he's cautious, understanding that laws have long-term effects. Now, with this one, the way they presented it to him, he might think there's no harm. O king, for the next 30 days, so it's a limited period of time, just for 30 days, and then everybody can go back and petition their own gods, and whoever else, petition the governors and the satraps and whoever else, but for the next 30 days we're going to honor the king. And so, you know, what long-term ramifications are there from that? 30 days from now, the law is void. And so I'm sure that Darius thought, well, there's no problem with this. It'll exalt me for 30 days, and then we'll go back to normal. And what king doesn't like to have his ego stroked? And so he goes ahead and he signs the law. Verse 9, therefore King Darius signed the written decree. So what does the faithful servant of God do when a law has been passed that makes it illegal to pray? Verse 10, when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home. And in his upper room, with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day, and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days. That's an exceptional verse. What does the faithful child of God do when serving God is illegal? He serves God anyways. And this shows us a huge amount about his character. Again, he distinguishes himself above the average person. Everybody else in the realm, you know what they're doing. They've stopped petitioning their various gods, and there were a number of gods that would be represented there. Well, you know, talk to you later, talk to you in 30 days. But they've stopped. Daniel has not and will not. He went home and he prayed, which the law forbade him to do. In Acts 5 and at verse 29, the apostles have been commanded not to preach in the name of Jesus Christ anymore. And what they said in response to the Sanhedrin was this: we ought to obey God rather than men. You had to make whatever rules you want to, but if God tells us to do something, then we're going to do it. In the latter part of the verse, it says that this was his custom since early days. Daniel was in the habit of praying. It was ingrained in him. It was something that it was second nature, if you will. If this was not so, then let me suggest to you that Daniel would have likely yielded to this law. If it was not his custom, if it was not something that he always did, then it would be easy to just give in to the law. Compromise comes easy to the one who does not have sincere conviction. Daniel had sincere conviction. And so rather than refraining from praying or cutting back on prayer or going down to the basement to pray, he prayed 3 times, as was his custom, in the upper room with his window open toward Jerusalem. Now, what did he pray about? We're not told. I don't think that his prayer went, Lord, how could you let this happen? I suspect that's not the case. The one thing we do have in the text, it says that he prayed and gave thanks. It's very hard to complain to God about things happening and give thanks at the same time. And so I don't think that it was a prayer of complaint. 1 Thessalonians 5 and at verse 18, the Apostle Paul says, in everything give thanks. You notice he doesn't say in some things give thanks. In the good things give thanks. He says in everything give thanks. Paul, when he's writing to the Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, he talks about his thorn in the flesh. And he prayed to God that it might be removed. And the Lord said, my grace is sufficient for you. When we are weak, then God's strength can be displayed through us. When times are bad, then that's when we are forced to rely upon God even more. And so in everything, give thanks. He went home having heard that the decree was signed, and he prayed to God and gave thanks. Lord, help me through this. I know you're with me. Now, have you ever wondered about this upper room and open window deal? Have you ever thought, like, come on, Daniel, just close the window and they won't know that you're praying? Why pray with this window open facing Jerusalem? Go over to 1 Kings chapter 8. And I think the answer is given to us there. 1 Kings and chapter 8. I'm going to start reading at verse 46. Let me give you some context for the text that we're going to here. The temple has just been built, and the dedication of the temple is underway. And what we've entered into here in the text is Solomon's prayer at the dedication ceremony of the temple. And so this is well before the time of Daniel. But as Solomon is praying, he acknowledges that the day would come when God's people would turn their backs on God and they wouldn't be faithful to him, and they would be taken captive to a foreign land. He's prophesying in his prayer. And so let's pick up at verse 46. It says, when they sin against you, for there is no one who does not sin, and you become angry with them and deliver them to the enemy, and they take them captive to the land of the enemy, far or near. Yet when they come to themselves in the land where they were carried captive, and repent, and make supplication to you in the land of those who took them captive, saying, we have sinned and done wrong, we have committed this. And when they return to you with all their heart and with all their soul in the land of their enemies who led them away captive, and pray to you toward the land which you gave their fathers, the city which you have chosen, and the temple which I have built for your name, then hear in heaven your dwelling place, their prayer and their supplication, and maintain their cause, and forgive your people who have sinned against you, and all their transgressions which they have transgressed against you, and grant them compassion before those who took them captive, that they may have compassion on them. For they are your people, your inheritance, who you brought up out of Egypt, out of the iron furnace. Do you see what he just said? Solomon, years before they would be taken captive, in prayer at the dedication of the temple, acknowledged your people are going to turn against you in the future, and you're going to have them taken captive. But when they come to their senses, when they realize their sinfulness, and they turn to you in repentance and confess their sins, and how did he word it? He said, when they pray to you toward the land which you gave to their fathers, the city which you have chosen, and the temple which I have built in your name. What is Daniel doing? He has his window open toward Jerusalem. He's doing the very thing Solomon talked about. Why does Daniel have his window open? He's demonstrating his faith in God. He understands that there were some promises that were made, that when he does this, and he also understands the timing. He knows what Jeremiah said about how long they would be in captivity. He knows about the 70 years, and he knows that that time is up. And so the circumstances, his faith is bolstered in all this, and so he is demonstrating faith. I'm going to pray facing Jerusalem just as Solomon said I should. It is one thing to say, I believe that God is watching and that he hears me and that he'll bless me. It is quite another thing to stake your life on it. That is what he is doing. He believes that God is watching and that God will bless him, and that, look again at, verse 49, hear them, verse 50. Grant them compassion before those who took them captive, that they may have compassion on them. He's expecting that compassion to be shown. Daniel was a student of the law and a student of the prophets. He knew the time was right. And so he demonstrates his faith. Well, the plan couldn't have worked any better for the governors and the satraps. There they are looking up at Daniel's window. And sure enough, Daniel's out there praying just like he always does. Verse 11, they watched him and they saw him make supplication. Verse 12, they go to the king. The first thing they want to do with the king is they want to make sure that the decree he signed is set in his mind. That he's not trying to think of ways around this or of loopholes or anything of that nature, that it's set in his mind that this is the decree. And so verse 12, they go into the king, they speak to him. Have you not signed a decree that every man who petitions any god or man within 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, the thing is true, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which does not alter. Good. Thank you. I'm glad that you have stated that the law does not alter, that this is how it's going to be. They want to take away any opportunity for him to wiggle out of the decree. And so verse 13, they now lay the charge against Daniel. That Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, does not show due regard for you, O king, or for the decree that you have signed, but makes petitions 3 times a day. We saw him ourselves. They had cell phones then. They could have taken a picture and taken that for him, right? But he's got the word of several people. We saw Daniel praying in his window. You see the emphasis on one of the captives? He's not one of us. He doesn't belong among us. That's part of their problem. That's why they hate Daniel. He's a prisoner of war, not a government official. He does not show due regard for you. Daniel certainly did regard and honor the king. That's why the king was ready to promote Daniel to be head over the whole realm. You don't get that when you don't show respect for those who are your superiors. He does not show regard for the petition or for the decree that you've signed. It's an evil law. Daniel couldn't obey it. Verse 14 is interesting. The king, when he heard these words, was greatly displeased with himself. He's not upset at Daniel. Daniel is being the upright guy that he always is. Daniel is doing the things that distinguish him from everybody else. The king was displeased with himself and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him, and he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. Understand, Darius was not an evil man intent on destroying other people. That's not why he signed the decree. He'd been played. He allowed pride to get in the way. And those who are in public office, it's, I think, more tempting for them to let pride get in the way. When people say, we want to exalt you in some way, well, he fell for it. But now we see the true Darius. He sets his heart on finding a way. Is there some way I can get Daniel out of this predicament that I put him in? And unfortunately, there's nothing he can do. Verse 15, these men approached the king and said to the king, know, O king, that the law of the Medes and the Persians, it is the law of the Medes and the Persians that no decree or statute which the king established may be changed. The law is the law is the law. You can't change it. You need to put Daniel to death. And so in verse 16, the king gave the command, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. He spoke, saying to Daniel, your God whom you serve continually, he will deliver you. Think about that. This is a pagan king, and he is saying to Daniel whom he needs to put into the den of lions because Daniel broke a dumb law. The king is now saying to him, I have confidence that your God can save you. I couldn't do it, but I have confidence that your God can. I wonder how much Daniel has told Darius about God. You see, the way that chapter 6 is written, Darius and Daniel are familiar with one another. It's not just that he's one of the people that's under Darius. He knows Daniel quite well. And I wonder if Daniel has told him about chapter 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and how they refused to bow down to the statue that was put up by Nebuchadnezzar. And then they were thrown into this fiery furnace. But when Nebuchadnezzar looked in, there was 1, 2, 3, 4. I thought we threw in 3 men. The 4th one has the appearance of the Son of God. And they come up out, they don't even smell like they've been in fire. I wonder if Daniel has told Darius about the works of God back even as far as the people coming up out of Egypt, the plagues that took place in Egypt, the crossing of the Red Sea, the 40 years in the wilderness, all the details of what God has done. Because pagan kings don't just come along and say, well, that God that you serve, I think he might be able to save you. Your God whom you serve continually, he will deliver you because he knows the power of God. Verse 17, the den is sealed, and so Daniel is locked in with lions. The lions have not had a meal. That would defeat the purpose. They have been kept starving for a time so that they will be hungry. If ever there was a night to spend in prayer, this would be that night. And I suspect that Daniel did a lot of praying. Back at the palace, Darius is fasting, verse 18 tells us. He refuses any entertainment to be brought in, and he can't sleep. I don't know that he prayed. Maybe Darius didn't think that he could pray to God. But he certainly can't sleep, and he's not going to eat, and he's not going to have entertainment. He's concerned for Daniel. I wonder if Daniel got more sleep that night than Darius did. Now, I don't know. If you've been praying since you were put in at 6 p.m. or whatever time, and it's 2 o'clock in the morning, and the lions still haven't touched you, I don't know. Do you feel comfortable enough that with God and his care for you that maybe Daniel had some sleep that night? I'm not sure. Darius did not. The next morning comes. Darius, of course, is up very early because he didn't go to bed. He didn't go to sleep. First thing he does is he runs out to the lion's den. And it's basically the statement that he left Daniel with, modified to a question. Has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to save you, been able to deliver you? And I'm sure it was a relief, verse 21, when he hears, O king, live forever. O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths so that they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him. And also, O king, I have done no wrong before you. Remember what we said? Daniel obeys God and distinguishes himself, and God blesses Daniel for it. It's happened again. Daniel didn't apologize to Darius for having prayed to God. O king, I've done no wrong to you. He did no harm to Darius by serving the Creator. And Darius understands that. So Daniel is brought up from the den, and Daniel's accusers are actually cast into the den along with their families. And the lions are hungry, and so they're immediately consumed. It's interesting that Darius does this. This is actually a sense of justice. And the idea to punish those who determined to harm one who was innocent and to bring the same punishment upon them, that's actually a biblical principle. Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 19. I don't know. Did Daniel share the law of God with Darius? Could be. But what he does is certainly a biblical principle. Verse 25 through 28, this is how the chapter closes out. Then King Darius wrote, to all people, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and steadfast forever. His kingdom is the one which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall endure to the end. He delivers and rescues, and he works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. It's hard to read that and not think that Daniel talked to Darius a lot about God. He is the living God. I don't know that that's the kind of terminology that pagans ever used about their stone and wood gods, right? But he is the living God. Where did he get that idea? Daniel told him about the living God. Not only that, his kingdom is the one which shall not be destroyed. His dominion shall endure to the end. That sounds a lot like chapter 2, what Nebuchadnezzar was learning from the statue that he saw in his dream. He delivers and rescues. Well, you just saw that here, but that's chapter 3. That's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who were brought up out of the fiery pit. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, has delivered Daniel. Daniel's told him about his God. And now Darius believes that this is the God we need to honor and fear. Very similar to this, in chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar made a decree. And so two pagan kings decreeing for everybody in their realm, we need to honor the God of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That's something. Do you remember why God's people were in Babylon in the first place? Because they wouldn't honor their God. And now we've got pagan kings who are saying we need to honor the God of these people. And then when Cyrus comes along, the first decree Cyrus makes is the Jews go home. Go rebuild your city, go rebuild your temple. Here are some provisions to help you in doing that. 3 pagan kings who all honor God. The last verse of the chapter simply tells us that Daniel prospered through the reigns of Darius and Cyrus, and that is because he served the Lord. All right, let's apply this to us, and then the lesson will be yours. Daniel distinguished himself. Have we distinguished ourselves? Back in chapter 1 and verse 8, Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself. Have we purposed in our heart not to defile ourselves? There are all kinds of things that this world will offer to defile us. We need to purpose in our heart not to. We need to seek to walk consecrated lives, lives that are devoted to God, following His word. That's what Daniel did. We're going to distinguish ourselves. That's what we need to do. In chapter 6 and at verse 3, we were told that he had an excellent spirit. Romans chapter 8, verse 5, beginning, those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh, but those who live according to the Spirit, the things of the Spirit. For to be carnally minded is death, but to be spiritually minded is life and peace. Because the carnal mind is enmity against God, for it is not subject to the law of God, nor indeed can be. So then, those who are in the flesh cannot please God. Are we in the flesh or in the Spirit? What's our focus? Do we also have an excellent spirit? Is the Spirit of God evident in our lives? It was in Daniel's life. It needs to be in ours. In chapter 6 and at verse 4, they could find no fault in Daniel, nothing to accuse him of. He was faithful in his work. They searched and searched and searched the records. There's nothing there. Colossians chapter 3, verse 22 beginning, Paul says this, bondservants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in sincerity of heart, fearing God. And whatever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance, for you serve the Lord Christ. But he who does wrong will be repaid for what he has done, and there is no partiality. Are we diligent workers in the workplace? When we have a duty given to us by our employer, do we set our hands to that task and make sure that we do it? Or are we the type of worker that we're really, really busy when the boss is looking over our shoulder, and when the boss isn't looking over our shoulder, we're wasting time, we're wasting energy, wasting our boss's money, etc. God wants us to be always diligent in our service. As Paul is writing this portion in Colossians chapter 3, he addresses it to bondservants, but understand the principles applicable to the employee-employer relationship. It's the same kind of relationship. And what he says is, don't do it as eye service or as men pleasers, but do it out of sincerity of heart, fearing God. Do it before the Lord and not before men, because truly we're always serving the Lord. Daniel was faithful in his business affairs. We need to be as well. In chapter 6 and at verse 5, satraps and governors understood that Daniel's work ethic for the king was grounded in his faith in God. And so is the same true for you and I? Do we have faith that motivates us to action, that causes us to do the things we need to do? James 1 and verse 22, be a doer of the word, not a hearer only, deceiving yourselves. It does us no good to sit down and study and study and study and study, and then we get up and we don't do what we just studied. We wasted our time. We need to put it into practice. Luke 6 and at verse 46, Jesus says, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do the things that I say? If we're going to call him master, then we need to be obedient servants. And that's how Daniel presented himself before God. And then finally in Daniel 6 and at verse 9, the decree was signed. What if Christianity were outlawed? What if doing what we're doing right now was against the law? You know, there are places in the world where this is against the law. And do you know what God's people do? They do this anyways. It may not be a gathering quite this size. The gathering size might be smaller. But they still gather together. And they still praise God and they still study God's word. What if Christianity were outlawed? In verse 10, we saw Daniel. He's praying with his window open toward Jerusalem. Didn't matter. Judaism effectively was outlawed by Darius's law. Can't pray to God. His concern wasn't with the satraps and the governors seeing him. His concern was pleasing God, what God was seeing. Would they have caught us praying? Or would we be those who sheepishly capitulate to the law? Well, I guess it's only 30 days. It's only 30 days. So we're going to exalt somebody other than God for the next 30 days. That doesn't work. If serving God is just something we do, then we might stop doing it if it were against the law. If serving God is who we are, then we're not going to deny who we are. We will be prone to continue despite a change of law. Daniel didn't just serve God, he was a servant of God. He had committed himself to always serving God. Acts 4, verse 19. The apostles have been told, don't preach in the name of Jesus. Whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you more than to God, you judge. For we cannot but speak the things which we have seen and heard. They just said to the Sanhedrin, we have to obey God. Doesn't matter what man's law says, we have to obey God. And in the process of doing that and continuing to do that, that's how people distinguish themselves as servants of God. Daniel distinguished himself. Let's go distinguish ourselves. Let's present ourselves as faithful servants of God.